Okay, got it. Hello, everybody. Thank you for participating in this really much needed presentation. I'm Mary Croxton. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Chautauqua. And in a second, I'll introduce our speaker. But I would like to remind those of you who are not members, if they, you would consider joining us. We're a nonpartisan group educating millions of voters by sponsoring candidate forums and debates and activating voters by holding voter registration. We protect the rights to vote against threats and ensuring that everyone vote is counted. We foster civil dialogue about important community issues, protecting our natural resources, including reversing climate change, reducing our carbon footprint, and prudent land and water use. We also advocate for mental health issues as a part of our healthcare. So if you would like to consider joining us, you can write to Box 42, Fredonia, New York, and we will send a membership form. Now I would like to introduce Dr. John Staples. He is a professor of Russian and Soviet history at State University of New York at Fredonia. He teaches courses spanning all of Russian history, including the very recent period. His research addresses 19th century Russian imperialism in southern Ukraine, and he has regularly visited Ukraine and Russia since the early 1990s. Dr. Staples' work focuses primarily on the Mennonites in southern Ukraine, and one important byproduct of that focus is that he is a part of a group that helped found the Mennonite Centre in Ukraine, a humanitarian aid center in southern Ukrainian city of Molochansk, which was occupied by Russian troops last week. Although he is no longer directly involved with the center, he continued to support their work. And I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Staples. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, and good evening to everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to speak tonight. And what I'm going to do this evening is to provide you with some background about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, but also try to dispel some myths that have been making the rounds about the causes of the war. And of course, there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. So one of my concerns is that there's a real lack of expertise in the United States, well, in the West broadly, about Ukraine and about Russia, which means that we're getting some really, really poorly informed commentary from our usual news sources. And having said that, it seems to me that I ought to be clear from the start about the limitations of my own expertise. I'm a historian. My research does concentrate on the 19th century, and I'm definitely not an international relations scholar. I do follow current events in Ukraine and Russia closely. I read both languages, and I spend a lot of time in both places. And I also teach about the current situation. So I try to keep up with the scholarly literature on it. But for all of that, this makes me informed, but I don't want to claim to be truly expert. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on four common explanations that we've been hearing about the cause of the war. The first of these being that Russia is invading Ukraine to defend itself by preventing further expansion of NATO. The second, that Russia is invading Ukraine to remove an alleged Nazi regime that's persecuting Russians in Ukraine. The third, that Russia is invading Ukraine because it regards the Ukrainian territory as culturally and politically Russian and a natural part of the Russian nation. And the fourth, that Russia is invading Ukraine to continue its quest to reassert its imperial dominion over the former Russian and Soviet empires. And a spoiler alert here, the first two of these explanations are clearly and utterly false. The second two, I think, and they're closely related, are true. And then the last part of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about Putin and his role in all of this. So let me begin with the claim that Russia is defending itself from NATO expansion. And I'm just going to very quickly share my screen here so I can show you a map, okay? Um, So this is a map showing the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since, well, its creation in 1949. So you can see these green ones across the center here are 1999 and 2004. And then since then, we've had a handful down at the bottom of the map in the Balkans, a handful of expansions. So the thing I'd stress from that map is that the last significant expansion of NATO occurred in 2004, so 18 years ago. Well, Putin has made the claim several times that this war is motivated in part out of a desire to protect Russia from the expansion of NATO and from the threat NATO is to Russia. But I have to tell you that no true expert that I have encountered who is truly expert on Russian international relations believe this is true. And in fact, I suggest to you that anybody who tells you this is guaranteed not to be a real expert. NATO was created, of course, to contain Soviet aggression. And arguably, I mean, I'd make the argument that it was a strategic blunder to keep the organization around after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And it's certainly true that Russia opposes NATO expansion. But given that it's 18 years since the last expansion, it would be, I mean, apart from adding Montenegro and North Macedonia, which aren't threatening Russia, I think it's hard to argue that a war in 2022 is responding to this long ago now expansion. I'd add that though Ukraine would certainly love to join NATO, for obvious reasons right now, there has been no movement in this direction whatsoever. No NATO country has indicated any willingness to let it happen. So that's not really part of the equation, I don't think. There is one other important part of this argument, because I would say that even if we believe that NATO was the cause of the invasion, we have to ask ourselves if Russia has any legitimate right whatsoever to make decisions about the international relations of its neighbors. I mean, Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and Poland and so on have a right to make their own decisions about their own foreign policy. These are sovereign nations. And to deny them that right is to accept that Russia has a right to reassert its Soviet sphere of influence, which for me is a complete non-starter. One last thing about NATO. Even if it was a bad idea to keep NATO around in the 1990s, it seems to me that by 2007, NATO, or something very much like it, was clearly necessary again. I think the only thing that's preventing Russia from attacking a lot of those surrounding countries is their membership in NATO. Well, let's move on then to the claim that Russia is invading Ukraine to remove a Nazi regime that is persecuting Russians in Ukraine. And there are really two parts to this claim. One is that the Ukrainian government is Nazi, and that the second is that the Ukrainian government persecutes ethnic Russians. Well, to start with the first half of this, the claim that this is somehow a Nazi government, this is just clearly absurd. It is a democratically elected liberal government. Ukraine's last two elections have been closely monitored by international observers. They've been judged free and fair. It's also worth just pointing out that Ukraine's really heroic president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish, that three of his great uncles died at the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust. This does not mean that there aren't Nazis, or rather at least fascists in Ukraine. I mean, they are a fringe element in Ukrainian politics. But let's face it, there are fascists in the United States. That doesn't make the United States a fascist country. The second part of the claim is that the Ukrainian government persecutes ethnic Russians. This is also clearly false. You know, most Ukrainians are bilingual. The majority in the South and the East have Russian as their first language. The majority in the Northwest have Ukrainian as their first language. In the center of the country, it's a pretty even split. And people who speak Russian as their first language are very often ethnic Ukrainians, while those whom we label ethnic Russians, even if Russian is their first language, are more often than not Ukrainian by choice. I spent the majority of my time in Ukraine in the Russian-speaking areas, and I can tell you from my own experience that the newspapers and the radio stations and most businesses function mainly in Russian, without any hint of state interference. The population communicates comfortably in both languages. I'll tell you an experience I had several years ago now, traveling on a train in southern Ukraine. And I was sharing a compartment with a Ukrainian family, a man and a wife and their teenage daughter. And the parents sort of left the room and encouraged their daughter to talk to me because they wanted her to get to talk to a foreigner. And so I took the chance and I asked her, I said, tell me, what do you think of the language problem? And she looked kind of puzzled and she said, what language problem? I said, well, you're a Russian speaker, but, stuff in school is Ukrainian. Isn't this a problem? And she thought about it for a minute and she said, well, the classes are in Ukrainian, but on the playground, some of us speak Russian and some of us speak Ukrainian. But we all know Russian and Ukrainian both, and nobody really cares. Why is it a problem? And she thought for a second and she said, except for math. They should have to teach math in Russian because it's really hard anyway. This was the extent of her understanding of there being a real language problem. I'd finally like to stress here that in the cities where the fighting has been fiercest and the casualties highest, and Mariupol and Kharkiv and Melitopol, the vast majority of the Ukrainians who live in those cities and who are defending their country at incredible cost are Russian speaking as their first language. And they're demonstrating, I think, every single day that the real threat to so-called ethnic Russians in Ukraine is Russians. Well, this brings us to the claim that Russia is invading Ukraine because it regards the Ukrainian territory as culturally and politically Russian and a natural part of the Russian nation. Now, this has always been Putin's first defense for Russia's aggression. So I think we ought to take it very, very seriously. I think it's true that many Russians, including Putin, believe this to be true. Well, of course, we know that Ukraine's history as an independent country is pretty brief. I mean, there was a sort of an independent Ukrainian state before 1654, and a Ukrainian state existed briefly in 1918 to 1920, but the present Ukrainian state has only existed since 1991. Just because the state didn't exist as an independent state doesn't mean that a distinct Ukrainian identity and a desire for statehood didn't exist. Again, the Ukrainian language is clearly distinct. Ukrainian is no more a dialect of Russian than Russian is a dialect of Ukrainian. There's a distinct Ukrainian literature which celebrates Ukrainian national identity. The great Ukrainian poet, Taras Shevchenko, spent half his life in Tsarist jails for writing powerful Ukrainian nationalist literature. More recently, the Soviet Union harassed and jailed Ukrainian writers who dared to insist on their own unique culture. There's a distinct Ukrainian history written by Ukrainian historians like the great Mikhailo Khrushchevsky. In 1991, 92% of Ukrainians voted for independence from the Soviet Union. That includes well over half of those Ukrainians who self-identified as ethnic Russians. In 2004, and again in 2014, Ukrainians revolted en masse against a president who attempted to tie them more closely to Russia. And of course, I mean, the final and I think undeniable proof of the existence of this distinct people is the war they're fighting to protect their nationhood against Russia. This leads us to the claim that Russia is invading Ukraine to continue to reassert its imperial dominion over the former Russian and Soviet republics. Well, I think this is the best explanation for Russia's actions, though there is a little bit of a semantic problem with it. Many Russians actually believe that Ukraine is Russian by, at least in ethnocultural terms. So they certainly don't regard themselves as acting as imperialists. But if you accept that Ukraine is in fact a legitimate independent nation, then Russia is definitely acting as imperialists, regardless of how they understand what they're doing. You know, Russia has consistently worked to reassemble its Soviet empire since the mid 1990s. You think of the brutal Chechen War, first Chechen War of the mid 1990s, or the second Chechen War that began in 1999 and didn't end until 2010, as evidence of this push towards reestablishing the empire. But I think a better and a more important example for us is the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. And again, I'll share my screen briefly just to give you a map so you know what I'm talking about. Oh, I don't think I actually shared that, did I? Try it again. I've only done this several hundred times, so I haven't figured it out yet. So I don't know if you can see the top left-hand corner, if the little pop-up screen's in the way, but the top left-hand corner just shows you where Georgia is located. It's located between the Caspian and Black Seas, just to the north of Turkey and Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I'll emphasize that on this map, there are two regions identified as Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia. These two regions became central to the Russian justification for this war. So I think that what we have in this Russo-Georgian War is a clear and very important example of Russian imperialism in the recent period. And the war goes a long way to explain Russia's actions and expectations in Ukraine during the present war as well. So like Ukraine, Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. And also like Ukraine, after that declaration of independence, Russia retained a very strong influence in Georgia. The high-ranking Soviet Communist Party leader, Edvard Shevardnadze, was Georgia's president until 2003. And Shevardnadze had very close ties with the Russian leadership. Well, in 2003, in the Rose Revolution, the Georgian people pushed Shevardnadze out of power and instead brought to power through an election the strongly Western-oriented government, a very strong-oriented Western government that tried to reshape Georgia's place in the world more focused on the West. For Russia, this was problematic in two ways. One is that Russia wanted to retain influence over Georgia. The second is that it seems clear that Putin feared democratic revolutions that in the surrounding territories because he feared they might in some way infect his own population. So in 2008, as Georgia slipped further and further from Russian control, Russia attacked Georgia under the pretense of defending Russians and Russian sympathizing minorities in Georgia. So again, this sounds exactly like the justifications for the Ukrainian war. The Russo-Georgian War, which lasted just 12 days, saw Russia use its overwhelming military superiority to force Georgia to surrender. At the end of the war, Russia insisted that the two minority-dominated areas in South Ossetia and Abkhazia be granted autonomy, though in practice, really what was happening is these areas now became Russian protectorates where Russian troops are stationed to permanently threaten Georgia. I think the example here of two breakaway republics used as an excuse for war has obvious relevance to what's happened in Ukraine. So what I want to stress here is that Russia learned an important lesson from this war. It learned that the West was prepared to ignore Russia's use of force to reassert influence in the territories of the former Soviet Union. I mean, the West, we all expressed indignation. You know, we sternly waggled our collective finger, and then we did nothing at all. This leads us to Ukraine's Maidan Revolution of 2014. Russia meddled in Ukrainian politics throughout the post-Soviet period, but this meddling came to a head in 2013 to 2014. This is a result of the fact, it really was rooted in the fact that after 2008, Putin focused his attention on creating what he called the Eurasian Economic Union. And he saw this as a kind of counter to the European Union, but he also clearly saw it as an economic mechanism for reinforcing Russian dominance in that region. And Ukraine was absolutely critical to his plan. After all, Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe by landmass after Russia. It's the seventh largest by population. It has really rich natural resources. It has a huge and productive agricultural sector. So all of this was going to be important to the idea of the Eurasian Union. Now, Putin in 2010 had been successful in helping a pro-Russian guy by the name of Viktor Yanukovych to become Ukrainian president. And this gave Putin hopes that he would succeed in his plan, because Yanukovych was very much Putin's creature. By 2013, Yanukovych faced a huge problem. See, for years, Ukraine had been moving towards membership in the European Union, not the Eurasian Union. There was broad support for joining the European Union. Ukrainians broadly wanted to become closer with Western Europe. In fact, Ukraine was scheduled to take its first step in the process of joining the European Union by signing an association agreement in November 2013. So Russia demanded that Yanukovych pull out of this agreement and join the Eurasian Union instead. So Yanukovych, feeling that he had no choice because of the pressure from Russia, which clearly had bought him, announced that Ukraine was pulling out of the EU agreement. And in response, Ukrainians rose up in the Maidan Revolution of 2014. Yanukovych fled to Russia. Today, he's actually being touted by Russia as a possible head of a Russian-occupied Ukraine. Despite the fact that he's apparently spent most of the last 7 years in an alcoholic stupor. So the Maidan Revolution was an enormous blow to Putin's ambitions. This desire to assert Russia's economic dominance in Eastern Europe was undermined by Ukraine's revolution and its insistence on reorienting itself to the West. And of course, for Putin, who after 2012 was becoming increasingly unpopular in Russia, it once again raised the fear of a democratic challenge to his own power as well. Well, this brings us to Russia's response to the Maidan Revolution. Let me just give you one more map. So I'm going to focus on 3 areas here. One down at the bottom of the map, the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine. And up here in the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, the 2 separatist areas, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. So Russia's response to the Maidan Revolution was first and foremost to annex the Crimea. A violation of all international norms. And by the way, I should just briefly stress here too, that this annexation has led to what amounts to a cultural genocide aimed at the Crimean Tatar population. And then secondly, the response was to create and fund and supply separatists in these so-called People's Republics that has kept a 6-year simmering conflict going that has led to thousands of Ukrainian deaths. Well, the Western response to these actions, it was greater than the response to Russia's attack in Georgia, but it was still pretty half-hearted. Public condemnations again, but also some significant sanctions. But despite those sanctions, backroom deals to secure cheap oil and natural gas really undercut the sanctions. And Putin's successful efforts to bring about the election of authoritarian leaders in Western countries helped him also to undercut the sanctions regime. So the message here, once again from the West, was that Russia could get away with violent intrusions into neighboring countries. I mean, Russia concluded from this that the West was weak. Well, then, how do we get from Maidan to the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022? The background I've described so far shows a pattern of Russian aggression against Ukraine, but it doesn't really explain why Russia chose to invade Ukraine now. And frankly, there is no obvious explanation, and none that I'm aware of. Only, I guess, informed speculation. And by the way, I've yet to encounter a real expert who really does have a hard and fast explanation either. But here are some possibilities. Maybe Putin is worried about his declining popularity with his own population. He has increased his authoritarian power in Russia over the last several years. He's limited and now almost completely shut down the free press. He's increased his propaganda campaign. And there are growing signs of discontent. Recent popularity polls suggest that real support has dipped below 50% for Putin for the first time since 2014. You know, the annexation of Crimea actually briefly boosted Putin's popularity with his own people. And he may hope that this war will do the same. So, you know, of course, it looks like a failure on this front. I mean, the annexation of Crimea was achieved really easily with little consequences for Russia. That doesn't seem to be the case this time around, but that might be what Putin intended or expected. It's also possible that Russia is worried about its own long-term plan, to destabilize Ukraine, to increase Russian influence there, is failing. I mean, it was failing. It's clear that it's not worked. This 7 years of interfering and supporting this war along the border has failed. Ukraine the outcome of this war in Ukraine has been increased unity and increased hostility to Russia. Ukraine's intention to more closely integrate itself is growing. So this war might be seen as a last great attempt by Russia to reunite its former empire by force after other methods have failed. And I suppose Russia might think that the longer it waited to take this step, the less likely it was to succeed. We also might imagine that Russia, in its strategy to undermine Western democracies, saw that that was failing, that its successes in promoting authoritarianism in the West was failing, and that increased kind of Western unity and cohesion was a challenge to Russia. And what I'm talking about here are all kinds of things. You know, Russia's role in promoting the British exit from the European Union was part of that policy of destabilizing the West. Russia's backing of extremist anti-EU political parties in France and Italy and Germany and Austria. These were all efforts to undermine the West, but the European Union seemed to be surviving these efforts. So it was a policy that was failed. And of course, you know, part of Russia's policy too was to influence the 2016 elections in the United States. Russia saw President Trump as an ally. And Trump weakened NATO and weakened respect for the United States and the European Union. But the election of President Biden marked a sharp reversal for Russia's efforts in the United States. It caused the renewal of American support for NATO and the improvement of US relations with the EU. So these are all setbacks for Russia. And maybe this helped to account for Russia's sort of now or never attitude in Ukraine. And of course, you know, finally, we have to consider that this all might just be a vanity project for Putin himself. An aging, increasingly isolated leader. It's possible that he sees this war as a way to regain control of Ukraine, but also to cement his own legacy, something which he clearly cares a lot about. So this kind of leads to the question of Putin. And I've been trying, as I'm making this presentation, to refer to the policies and actions of Russia and not Putin. I'm not entirely succeeding, I fear. But I think there is a strong temptation to characterize this war as something carried out by Putin and perhaps without the support of the Russian people. And if we believe this, I mean, the benefit of believing that is we can think that the solution is really easy. If we get rid of Putin, then all the problems go away, and we can go back to ignoring Russia. But I'd like to suggest to you that this is not true, or at least it's only partially true. We should remember that Putin is the popularly elected president of Russia, that he's enjoyed significant support from his population throughout his tenure. And that support might not still be from the majority of Russians, but it is probably, we know it's very significant. It's real support. And of course, we should remember too that Putin is not personally invading Ukraine and launching missiles, right? His military and his bureaucracy are following his orders and showing little sign of resistance. His police are beating and arresting protesters and showing no signs of resistance. His wealthy oligarchs are using their influence to promote and support his actions. And while we are seeing some brave protests in Russian cities, the protesters are a tiny minority. So, if Putin were removed today by a coup, which seems like the only way to get rid of him, then this would undoubtedly end the war right now, but it would most likely leave Russia with its enormous army and its nuclear arsenal in the hands of a military dictatorship. A military dictatorship that would be able to take advantage of a well-formed system of authoritarian government. And this might actually be better than having Putin in charge right now, but it leaves us with enormous uncertainty. If we think about whether it's Putin or Russia, I also have to ask, what were the conditions that allowed Putin to gain power and to retain power? And as I do so, let's just very briefly touch on where we seem to stand today. Because I have to think that if there had not been Putin, there would have been somebody very like Putin in charge in Russia. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we in the West kind of breathed a huge sigh of relief, and then we washed our hands of the whole affair. The conditions that led to Putin's rise emerged out of the catastrophic conditions in Russia in the 1990s, and we ignored the poverty and desperation of the Russian people. And worse yet, we placed conditions on the financial aid that we offered to Russia that ensured poverty and ensured deep inequalities in Russia. This has helped Putin convince his people that the West is out to get them and that he's their only champion. We also ignored the war crimes that Russia committed in Chechnya. In fact, after 9/11, we accepted Russia's rebranding of the Chechen War as part of the war on terror. In practice, we endorsed Russian war crimes. And by the way, I keep saying we, and I should say that I'm a Canadian, and my government is every bit as guilty of this as the rest of the Western world. So if we want to have a peaceful future and in our relations with Russia, if we don't want to live under the threat of nuclear war, then I think we need to think hard about our policies toward Russia in the future. How do we keep Russia, or how do we help Russia re-enter the international community? Well, not simply ignoring its crimes in Ukraine. So I want to wrap up my prepared comments and allow for questions. And I'll finish just by noting that Russia has been very clear on its goal, which is to bring Ukraine under direct Russian control. And Russia seems to have assumed that there would be very little response and resistance in Ukraine. It seems to have assumed that the West would again impose no meaningful consequences. As you know, Ukraine has resisted valiantly, far beyond anybody's expectations. If you had asked me 2 weeks ago today, when this war started, how long could Ukraine hold out? I would have said 4 or 5 days. Today, I'm not convinced it's not going to hold out altogether. So far, the West has shown really remarkable unity and imposed truly devastating economic sanctions on the Russian economy. But our questions today, the ones that we can't answer, are how long can Ukrainian resistance last? I don't know. How long will the Western unity last? I don't know the answer to that. I hope both things will last. And then in the end, that Russia will lose this horrible war. But I'm less optimistic than I wish I was. So with that, I'll conclude my comments and welcome questions.
As we stated before, well, yeah, okay, as we stated before, you can put a question in the chat, but I see Joy Bilhars has her hand up. So Joy, go ahead.
Hi, John. My question is, what is the legal basis for the sanctions against the oligarchs? And could the oligarchs be the source of a Russian coup?
Okay, I'm probably not qualified or capable of answering the legal basis. I mean, it is clear that the oligarchs act as a funnel for for Russian money, government money, as well as other money into the West and out again. And it is clear that the oligarchs work for Putin, in some cases are tightly tied to him. So I think that they are justified. But as for the legal justification, you'd have to ask somebody that knows a lot more about international law than I did, or American law. As for the idea of a coup, I have to say that I am very doubtful that a coup is going to happen, at least anytime soon. If it does happen, though, I don't think it'll come from the oligarchs. The challenge is that the oligarchs don't really have access to Putin in any direct way, and they don't control the kind of forces that would necessarily be in play. Insofar as there is a kind of crossover between the oligarchs and senior government officials and military officials, then I suppose that there might be some involvement. But I think were there to be a coup, you'd have to imagine it coming from within the military. That's the most likely place, because of the command structures and the forces that could be brought to play. The trouble with any expectation of a coup is that Putin has had a long time to build a system that protects him. The security police, his own bodyguard system, all of this is very well structured. And he's also, working out of the authoritarian playbook. He has been very good at kind of dividing and his supporters and his government, the leading government figures, and playing them against one another. So they're all watching each other in an effort to, gain favor with Putin, and they're liable to turn on each other at any moment. So if the war goes badly enough, and if the economic situation gets badly enough, then maybe a coup might come from the highest levels of government or the military or some combination of that. But sadly, I don't think we're very close to that at all. I think we shouldn't hold our breath on it.
Thanks.
Do you think there's a diplomatic solution that would permit Putin to save face and end the war?
Yes, maybe not quite yet, but I think that there's the possibility of one emerging. The trick here is that it has to be one that is acceptable to Ukraine, and that is a much more tricky, because so far what Russia has demanded in its negotiations, there are ongoing negotiations, is far beyond what Ukraine can reasonably be expected to accept. I do take, some hope in the fact that Russia seems to have backed away from its most extreme demands. It is no longer, for example, insisting that Zelensky be removed, but it continues to ask far too much, and that wouldn't be acceptable to Russia. If such a thing were to occur, I imagine it would revolve around Ukraine, and perhaps with guarantees from the rest of the world, acknowledging the two breakaway republics and Crimea as independent, and therefore, a step towards their joining Russia. And, in practical terms, at this point, that might be acceptable to Ukraine. The Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics have been so damaged by, first of all, the 2014 war, and then the horrific leadership they've experienced since, that anybody who controls them is going to have to invest vast sums in rebuilding protecting them. And it may be that at this point, that would be acceptable to Ukraine. But politically, I'm not sure it's acceptable to anybody in Ukraine yet. So yes, there's a possibility. As things grow more desperate, as the number of civilian casualties rise, Ukraine may be willing to accept some amount of this. But the problem also lies with Russia, that Russia will have to do much worse in this war before it will be willing to back away from much bigger demands that can't be acceptable to Ukraine. So if that's a possibility, I suspect it's one that it's weeks, if not months in the future.
I have a two-part question in the chat. First part, do you think Putin is bluffing on use of nuclear weapons?
Okay, so I think that he is, but I'm not confident he is. So here's the thing. Nuclear weapons, Russia has used it's sometimes called nuclear signaling before. It did this in 2014 when it annexed Crimea. And it works for them, right? But this only works as long as it's only a threat. That it is a way of making the West extremely cautious. And it has to make the West extremely cautious. The possibility of this happening is horrifying. And once Russia uses nuclear weapons, there is no going back. So this makes the war inevitably far, far larger and far more damaging. Of course, if Russia starts a nuclear war, they're not going to win it because nobody will win it, right? But what it means is it would be an act of suicide for Russia to use nuclear weapons. So these are all good reasons to think it is unlikely, very unlikely. The problem with this is that and I think almost every other observer in the West that was paying attention really didn't think Ukraine or Russia was very likely to invade Ukraine at all, at least not on the scale it has. Again, 3 weeks ago, if you'd asked me, I'd said, yeah, I think there's a real threat. And I think that there's a real possibility that Russia might at least invade Donetsk and Luhansk. But this wholesale war and the accompanying attacks on civilians are way beyond anything that I imagined. And it makes no sense to me. I think that it is that Russia has already lost. Even if it occupies Ukraine, it's lost. The damage is long-term. And I can't understand how that could happen. That means that I can't pretend to understand what Putin will do, especially if Russia reaches the point where it's clear that they are losing this war and that they will gain no face, there will be no face-saving gains whatsoever. On which I think the second part of the question is about no-fly zones, right? I saw that.
Yes, thank you, yeah.
Yeah, and boy, you see, this is such a tough question. This is the one that maybe keeps me up at night most. And here's why. No-fly zones lead to the possibility, almost the certainty, of American and Russian conflict, at least over the skies of Ukraine, because Russia will not honor the no-fly zones, and ultimately there will be American planes shooting at Russian planes. That's what will happen. And this is the step that could make a much larger war, including a nuclear war, much more possible. And we all want, nobody's in favor of a nuclear war. But then here's the thing that I as I say that and believe it, that haunts me. Does this mean that we are willing to say that we would sacrifice Ukraine rather than take that step? Is Ukraine an acceptable sacrifice to avoid the possibility of further conflict? And if the answer to that is yes, then I'd ask myself and other people, well, what if Russia then said it was going to invade Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, the Baltic states? Now, we are treaty bound to defend them through NATO. But if Russia threatened a nuclear war, would we just then say, well, we're willing to sacrifice Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And then there's Poland, and then it goes on, right? Is there any good reason to think that Putin would stop at the Ukrainian border? I fear that there might not be. I'm terrified that there might not be. And if that's true, then our willingness to sacrifice Ukraine, we don't look very good at that point. I don't think we have any moral high ground there. And so, yesterday, a political scientist told me, an expert on this region, by the way, said that if you don't know the outcome, then you have to move very, very cautiously. And I think that's true. We have to be very cautious. But as I see Ukraine suffering so terribly, as I see the growing number of attacks on civilian targets, the use of weapons that are internationally banned against Ukrainian targets, right? The bombing that hit a maternity hospital in Mariupol today, and I think, what will we do? At what point do we feel that we have no choice? And I say all of that while fearing the possibility that a no-fly zone could lead to a far worse war. I have no answer, in other words, and I have no position to take on this because it haunts me, but I don't know what we should do.
But isn't history repeating itself? This is what Hitler did when he invaded the German-occupied territory of Czechoslovakia. We had the Munich conference, we avoided a war, and then on September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. There were the alliances, and World War II started. Isn't this the same thing? If you don't stand up to Putin now, why do you think he would stop and not go and further expand? If he believes that he can reassert his domination over all the former Soviet republics, what's going to stop him if the rest of the world doesn't stand up? And much is made about the fact that we're not responsible legally to protect Ukraine because they're not part of NATO, but we all are part of the United Nations. And one of the fundamental precepts of the United Nations Charter is that countries respect other countries' sovereignty and they don't invade without provocation. So I find
Beyond
this
the
whole
United
thing
Nations,
moral.
beyond the United
Pardon me?
Nations, beyond the United Nations, we're part of humanity, and surely we have
Yes,
moral
exactly.
obligations
The whole thing
beyond these
is
world
moral.
organizations. Yeah.
We sit by and watch the Ukrainians being slaughtered miserably and celebrate their bravery and do nothing. And I feel
Well,
so morally compromised by that.
I do
It's-
too. But I think that the Nazi German example and in allowing Germany to invade the Sudetenland, believing that would satisfy them, is obviously a very good example.
Yeah,
However, and the key difference is that occurred before nuclear weapons existed.
yes.
And so it would have been possible, I think, to stop Hitler in 1938 and 1939 if the world, if could have agreed on how and been willing to act. Certainly nuclear weapons change the dynamic in an important way, because nuclear war can destroy all of us, right? And it's a very, very hard question as a result. And so again, I want to say, yes, we should establish a no-fly zone. I certainly feel that the failure to provide Ukraine with even more than we have already provided, the failure to find a way to give them those jet planes from Poland, the failure to provide missile defense systems more effective than the ones they have, all of these things we can do, and we should do. The no-fly zone, maybe we'll come to the point where we have to do that, but I fear it, and I do think that maybe moving slowly is still necessary. But I can't help but look at those images you know, images coming from cities that I know well, that I've walked the streets of and sat down and broke bread with the people who live there, and feel like surely we can do something.
Why isn't there more of an outrage in Russia? Is the information getting through? I mean, we're getting reports saying that a large number of Russians support this military action. How can that be?
So what we face in Russia is a lack of information and a lack of access to information broadly. For a decade now, Putin has increasingly ensured that he controls the airwaves, both radio stations and television stations, all the main sources of information about the West. And the number of available sources has declined and declined and declined, particularly Russian language sources, because lots of Russians can only absorb information in Russian language. And this complete state control of the media is a huge problem. Add to that this, I mean, people who are going off to their factory jobs in Russia, at the end of the day, when they come home, when they turn on the news, what they want to see is what are the sports scores and what's the weather going to be tomorrow. They're not consuming political news in any particularly active way. What that news is telling them is that there's no major war, that it is just a police action to defend Ukrainian rights. And they've been told for 15 or 20 years that the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine are under attack. They're being told that nobody is attacking civilian populations. They are being lied to in an outright manner, and they have no access to other information. And consequently, they accept what they're being told. That's the vast majority of them. They've come to believe, because the state has effectively told them this story, that the West is out to get them, that their problems, their economic problems, are a consequence of unjust Western actions, that the West doesn't accept the Russians. And they have no access to alternative sources of information. Some do, right? We have seen thousands of Russians in the streets protesting. But then this is the second thing. At least 13,000 Russians are now in jail for their protests against this war over the last 2 weeks. They are being savagely beaten. They are being threatened with 15-year jail sentences. We all like to think we would be heroic, right? We'd be one of the people who bravely went out into the streets and protested and accepted being beaten by police with batons and thrown into jail. I think at one time in my life, I probably believed that of myself. But I wonder today, I mean, if the consequence of my doing that was that I would be thrown in jail and lose my income, and that my family would lose their source of income, and that I would be subject to brutal treatment in horrible jails. Do I know that I would be that brave? I still hope I would, but I sure don't know it. And that's the choice that's facing Russians. On the one hand, many of them just don't know better. And on the other hand, they're afraid of an authoritarian government with the power to jail them and to persecute them and to hurt their families. And boy, that's a hard choice to be making for them. A hard choice.
I don't know. One question is, what might be the effects on this conflict of the election of a Trump-dominated Congress this November? I guess political scientists in our midst might be able to address that as well. What is your thinking?
Okay, so that would certainly, I mean, this Russia would like to see it. I think for Russia, the fact that this is a long way in the future is a problem, because I think this war and the situation will be resolved by then. I think that Russia has been so clearly portrayed as what it is, an aggressor carrying out the brutal slaughter of civilians, that a Republican Congress will not be in the position to do much about international reaction by then. And of course, I think the fact that as I understand it, and look at I'm a Canadian, and American politics is sometimes a mystery to me. But my understanding is that in as much as foreign policy is largely controlled by the president rather than, and obviously the Congress has purse strings, that I think that it won't change policy by then too much. And I think the election is too late to save Putin, if you like. That's my guess.
I have a quick question. After Chernobyl, I see that Ukraine has many, many nuclear stations, power stations. Is that a effort to for less reliance on Russian gas and oil? Or, I mean, you would think they'd be shy about nuclear power plants after Chernobyl.
They have always relied on nuclear power plants since the Soviet era. They produce a lot of power relatively cheaply and efficiently. If you set aside the danger of them blowing up, they are a cheap and efficient source of power. And for Ukraine, there's relatively few ways that alternatives for Ukraine. There have been. I mean, you've got the big hydroelectric dam on the Dnieper River, but it will only produce so much power. The idea of Ukraine transitioning to renewable energy, in the initial stages particularly, this is a very expensive venture. We know that there's payoff, but it is expensive and difficult to carry out. And Ukraine is a pretty poor country that has struggled economically, and since 2014 has been fighting a simmering war with Russia. So I think that there hasn't been much attempt in that direction. You would think that they would be very afraid of nuclear power. In fact, many of them are. But that's the system and the infrastructure they have, and they haven't seen any good way to move away from it. So
okay, do we have
I read that the Russians are about to take control of 85% of the power production in Ukraine, and I wonder how the effort, the resistance can continue if they don't have sources of electricity and water.
Yeah, that's good. That seems likely. They seem. I mean, it's been gone back and forth, but I think they now control the huge nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and there's another one down close to Odessa that they're not far from. But the resistance isn't very heavily dependent upon electricity. I think that this kind of warfare can be fought. Power can be diverted from places in the West into Ukraine to a degree, but it will make it much harder, and of course it will accelerate and increase the terrible suffering. I mean, if you think of Mariupol, which is a big city that is completely surrounded now, cut off, where the Russians have not honored agreements to allow civilians to leave. It has been without electricity for several days. It's very short on water. We have reports of people dying, not just from bombs, but from dehydration. There's a humanitarian nightmare unfolding there, and it will be very difficult. It will be very difficult, but people have fought under such circumstances in the past. And, I imagine that they will, at least for a long time. But it multiplies the tragedy. The fact that Russia carries out the war in this fashion is something that we all need to be very aware of. This is completely consistent with Russia's military practices in past wars. Russia carpet bombed civilian targets in Grozny and Chechnya, and again, the West ignored it. In Aleppo in Syria, Russia launched large-scale attacks on civilian targets. They were quite willing to level cities. And we've allowed Russia to get away with this. We shouldn't be surprised that they are using exactly the same tactics in Ukraine today. And the effects are appalling.
I see some thank yous in our chat here. I know we all appreciate your insight into things, and it was an excellent presentation. We don't like to go more than an hour. So if there are any other burning questions of anybody, you know, if you raise your hand, and if not, thank you all for participating.
I'm just going to quickly type my email address into the chat. So if
Thank you.
people have questions that they want to send to me, I'm
Great.
more than happy to answer them to the extent that I can. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, because I think we need to talk about it, and we need to inform ourselves as widely as we can. And I've appreciated the questions, which are good questions and thoughtful ones.
Well, thank you. Okay, if there are no more questions, again, thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to take this information and use it wisely. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.